let's bring it to the panelists. What are the primary, or excuse me, what are the primary considerations or pros and cons of partnering with, you know, a U.S.-based CDMO versus partnering outside of the U.S. And Conrad, I know you have some thoughts on this, so maybe we'll start with you. U.S. versus ex-U.S. For CDMO partners.
That's it's a question we're looking at on a regular basis. We're doing both because of the inherent nature of our therapies and the fast decay of the isotopes in question. We actually need both to reach patients for clinical development in both Europe and the US. Also, maybe just a word on the landscape. There isn't really, let's say, one big global player in our CDMO landscape. It's really more a landscape of national or maybe regional champions that have bespoke capabilities in specific geographies or areas. So it's still quite fragmented, and players are typically not that large versus other CDMOs. So we work with both partners in both geographies. And what really differs here is often the regulatory landscape. What can you do under which circumstances, radiation protection laws, which isotopes are allowed, etc. What I've seen so far is that CDMOs on both sides of the Atlantic are very advanced, given the investments made. It's certainly easier to do some development or contract manufacturing work in some specific geographies or countries. And that is also true for the US. Different states have very different regulatory frameworks. So naturally, for example, you have Indiana, which is becoming a bit of a super cluster for radiopharm development and manufacturing work because the regulatory environment just allows for that and is incentivizing that. So it really depends, which means for us, we have to follow a highly regionalized approach in those decisions.
Sesha, maybe I'll come to you next with this question. I mean, are you geography agnostic when you're reviewing partners for working with you as a CDMO? Are there any sort of primary considerations that you think about in the context of geographic location for a partner? What would you say?
That's a great question. I can tell you our supply chain currently spans multiple continents, and a lot of it is driven by necessity, right? Especially for what we do on a sterile product, ophthalmics, very limited choices we have. So we are forced to go and look for where the capability is, irrespective of geographical location. That being said, what we are seeing, a couple of key limitations, with geographical locations. One is, something we'd never thought a lot, in the past, but the geopolitical situations are constantly shifting. And that plays a real effect nowadays. It's not theoretical anymore. We saw supply chain disruptions, during the COVID period, and even during the Ukraine disturbance, and even now there are supply chain limitations. So you have to consider that, especially as you are in the more commercial stages. One other limitations we see, and this is true for sterile product, the US regulations are far more stringent than any other location, right? Even in Europe, companies are simply, they don't understand the US regulation. They are compliant with their local regulations for sterile products, but oftentimes, the regulations in the US are at a much higher level. So they don't understand those regulations. They don't develop the systems to address those things, and that becomes a huge barrier, right? If they don't have, the intent is good, but if they don't know what to do, or if their systems, the quality systems or the compliance systems, and even their sterile manufacturing capabilities are not up to compliance, for what the US asks for, that's a huge limitation in picking the right CMO ex-US. So we are seeing that, they're slowly catching up, and a lot of it is requiring investments by companies, which many of the ex-US companies are not willing to do, because unless they get a huge influx of US partners, it doesn't make economic sense for them. So there's a lot of those things play a role in it. It comes down to multiple aspects of it, and picking the right partner, and the partner who will work with you on either creating capabilities or meeting your requirements, But it's not a simple here versus there comparison anymore. It's multifaceted, multifactorial. It's become more complex to select CMOs ex-US.
I want to bring in another audience question, and Bethany, maybe I'll ask you to respond to this. We were chatting a little bit about geopolitical impact prior to the beginning of the taping. The question is, how does the geographic location affect supply chain resilience? And maybe I'll just add on to that question by asking, how can you mitigate risks potentially associated with, geopolitical risk, which, can be very hard to anticipate?
Yeah, it's definitely a big consideration. And supply risk mitigation is absolutely front and foremost of mind, I would say. And so you definitely have to have a multifaceted approach for how you manage that. So whether that's, again, and it starts all the way with raw materials, right, to the vendors you're using. And so you can look at redundancy, inventories, different geographical locations. So all of that should be considered. And it's hard, right? Because especially if you come from a small company, you're kind of just starting out. But I don't think you can start thinking too early about, what risks could come up, and how do we identify those risks, and how do we try to have some type of risk mitigation in place for it. And it's true, we also have a diversified supply chain in different parts of the world, and it's something that we have as part of a regular conversation within the team to try to figure out how we're going to make sure we don't have any supply disruptions.